The son, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. My father always says that true change happens one person at a time. He glanced at his father with obvious pride. Maybe you're today's person. The young waiter stepped forward, smartphone in hand. The story's ready to publish, he said, but I could add an update about what happened this morning. His eyes met Thompson's, offering not forgiveness, but an opportunity to show others that change was possible. Thompson looked around the restaurant, at the staff who had witnessed his worst moment, at the family who had shown him a better way, at the morning sun highlighting every detail of this moment of truth. Publish it all, he said. Sometimes we need to see our failures clearly before we can start to make things right. As the family turned to leave, the daughter heading to her competition, the son to his basketball game, the mother to her studio, and the father to his office, Thompson watched them go. They moved through the world with the confidence of people who knew exactly who they were and what they stood for. The press was still waiting outside, cameras ready, but Thompson didn't care about the headlines anymore. He had a different worry now, the worry of living up to this moment, of becoming someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. As he walked toward the door, ready to face the cameras and tell his story, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to change, to remember who he was meant to be, to make his immigrant grandparents proud. The young waiter watched him go, then turned to update his article. This wasn't just a story about prejudice anymore. It had become something else. A story about recognition, redemption, and the long hard work of becoming better than we once were. As morning light filled the restaurant, he began to type, knowing that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that show us change is possible, even in the hearts we least expect. The next morning, La Maison was quieter than usual for a weekend brunch. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm patterns on the polished floors. Thompson stood in the entrance, his heart pounding as if he'd run a marathon. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night reading and rereading the social media storm his behavior had sparked. He'd come early, asking the restaurant manager to help arrange this moment. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a humility he hadn't felt in years. The press had gathered outside. News travels fast in the digital age, but he'd asked them to wait. This wasn't about publicity or damage control. The family arrived exactly on time, responding to his request for a meeting. The father led them in, his arm protectively around his wife's shoulders. Their children walked close behind, faces showing a mixture of caution and curiosity. The daughter carried her science presentation materials. She had her competition later that day. Thompson stepped forward, his hands slightly shaking. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed to do this in person." The restaurant staff had gathered at a respectful distance, the young waiter among them, watching silently. "Last night," Thompson continued, "I showed everyone the worst version of myself. But you showed everyone the best of humanity, dignity, grace, and strength in the face of ignorance." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I spent all night thinking about how I became someone my parents would be ashamed of." The morning light caught the mother's artist's eyes, sharp and evaluating. The son stood tall beside his sister, their young faces serious but open. The father's expression remained neutral, professional, the look of a man who had heard many apologies in courtrooms and boardrooms. "I read about your work," Thompson said to the father. "The cases you've won, the lives you've changed. While I was building walls, you were breaking them down. While I was excluding people, you were fighting for inclusion." His voice cracked slightly. "Including people like my own grandparents, who faced the same prejudices I showed last night." He turned to the mother. "Your art exhibition next month, the series about belonging and identity in America. I dismissed it without even seeing it. Now I understand it's about people like me too, people who forgot their own history, their own family struggles." The daughter's science project caught his eye. "Your research on sustainable urban development, it's not just about buildings, is it? It's about creating spaces where everyone belongs. The same vision your father fights for in courtrooms, you're designing in cities." Thompson pulled out a thick envelope. "This isn't a bribe or an attempt to buy forgiveness. It's a donation to your law firm's diversity and inclusion initiative. Anonymous, no tax write-off, no publicity." And he reached for a second envelope. "This is a personal donation to the community center where your children volunteer. I read about their youth programs this morning. The father started to speak, but Thompson held up his hand. Please let me finish. I've also sent letters to my board and shareholders. I'm stepping down as CEO for 6 months. During that time, I'll be working with community organizations that help immigrant businesses, the same kind of businesses I once tried to push out of their neighborhoods. He turned to the young waiter. Your article, it's going to be published today, isn't it? The waiter nodded. Good. Don't change a word. People like me need to see ourselves clearly, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. The family exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. The father stepped forward, his hand extended. Actions speak louder than words, he said simply. We'll be watching to see what you do with this moment. Thompson nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. This wasn't about one apology or a few donations. It was about sustained change, about becoming someone different. As they shook hands, he noticed his own reflection in the restaurant's window, the same man as yesterday, but somehow different. Humbled. Awakened. The daughter stepped forward, offering a copy of her research summary. Maybe you'd like to read about what inclusive urban spaces really look like, she said. Her voice held no anger, only the clear determination of youth ready to change the world. The mother spoke next, her artist's perspective cutting to the heart of things. Pain can be a teacher, she said quietly, if we're brave enough to learn from it. She held out an invitation to her gallery opening. Come see how others view the world. Sometimes new perspectives are what we need most. Another memory surfaced. His father's pride when they'd finally saved enough to open their first small shop. In America, he'd said, success is built on merit, not birth. Thompson had believed that once. When had he started thinking he had the right to judge who belonged where? He watched as the son helped his sister organize her presentation materials, their teamwork natural and loving. These weren't strangers invading his space. They were the embodiment of American success, the very thing his own family had worked so hard to achieve. The mother's art portfolio lay beside her chair, gold-lettered gallery invitations visible inside. Thompson recalled reading about her recent exhibition, a series exploring themes of identity and belonging in modern America. He'd dismissed it then. Now, her work seemed like a commentary on this very moment. The restaurant's lights caught the father's wedding ring as he reached for his water glass. The simple gesture spoke of years of hard work, dedication, and love, building a family, a career, a legacy, just like Thompson's own father had done, just like Thompson himself had once dreamed of doing. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his sister. Mom and Dad would be ashamed. 3 generations of family history, of fighting against prejudice and creating opportunities for others, and Thompson had become what they had fought against. The weight of this realization pressed him back in his chair. The restaurant's familiar spaces suddenly felt different, not because they had changed, but because he was seeing them, and himself, clearly for the first time. The question now wasn't just about saving his reputation or his business. It was about who he wanted to be, about finding his way back to the values he'd once held dear. Tomorrow's headlines were already written. The videos were already spreading online. But Thompson was beginning to understand that this moment offered something more important than damage control. It offered a chance for genuine change, not just in his actions, but in his heart. Thompson sat alone at his table, the restaurant's gentle music now seeming to mock the chaos in his mind. The note's revelations had stripped away every justification he built around his behavior, leaving him face to face with uncomfortable truths about himself. His phone continued to buzz with urgent messages, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them anymore. Instead, his eyes were drawn to the family he had tried to humiliate. The father was now showing something on his phone to his children, probably photos from an earlier celebration. Their quiet laughter carried across the restaurant, a sound of genuine joy that made Thompson's earlier outburst seem even more shameful. A memory surfaced, unexpected and unwelcome. His own grandfather, who had arrived at Ellis Island with nothing but hope and determination, facing prejudice and exclusion as he built a life in America. Never forget where we came from, he'd always said. Success means helping others climb the ladder after you. When had Thompson forgotten those lessons? He watched as the daughter expertly discussed environmental impact studies with the venture capitalist at the next table. Her passion for science reminded him of his own daughter, who had moved across the country 2 years ago. "I can't stand what you've become, Dad," she'd said in their last conversation. "The man who taught me to judge people by their character seems to have disappeared." The son's discussion about law school with the federal judge carried clearly across the room. The boy's intelligence and poise were obvious. Thompson remembered his own early days in business, how certain doors had been closed to him because of his immigrant background. He'd fought against that prejudice, sworn to be different, yet here he was, becoming the very thing he'd once despised. His hand shook slightly as he reached for his water glass. The lawyer's recent court victory hadn't just been about corporate discrimination, it had been about creating systemic change. Thompson's own company had been quietly reviewing its hiring practices in response, though he tried to distance himself from those discussions. The mother's quiet strength drew his attention. She reminded him of his late wife, who had always been his moral compass. "Kindness costs nothing," she used to say, "but its absence costs everything." What would she think of him now? The thought made his chest tight with shame. A group of regular diners, people he considered friends, walked past his table without acknowledgement. Their subtle rejection stung, but he knew he deserved it. He'd shown everyone exactly who he was, or rather, who he'd allowed himself to become. The waiter passed by, efficient and professional as ever. Thompson now saw him differently, not just a server, but a young man working to pay for his education, documenting injustice, trying to make the world better. How many other stories had Thompson missed by seeing only what he wanted to see? His eyes fell on the lawyer's briefcase, visible beside their table. Earlier, he'd seen it as an intrusion into his world. Now he recognized the worn leather as a badge of honor. Countless battles fought for justice, lives changed for the better, barriers broken down. The man had used his success to help others, while Thompson had used his to build walls. The daughter's science project materials peeked out from a bag beside her chair. Thompson could see complex diagrams about urban development and sustainability. She wasn't just dreaming about the future, she was actively working to create a better one. And he had tried to make her feel unwelcome in a space she had every right to occupy. Looking around the restaurant, Thompson began to see it through new eyes. The mixing of different backgrounds and stories wasn't diluting the restaurant's excellence, it was enriching it. Each table held dreams, achievements, and potential. His attempt to claim exclusive ownership of this space now seemed not just wrong, but small-minded. His company's board meeting tomorrow morning loomed in his thoughts. They would expect answers, explanations, damage control. But for perhaps the first time in years, Thompson found himself questioning not just his actions, but the beliefs behind them. The note in his pocket felt heavier with each passing moment. It wasn't just evidence of his behavior, it was a mirror showing him what he'd become. The carefully documented incidents painted a picture of a man who had lost his way, forgotten his own family's history of struggle and triumph. He watched as the waiter moved efficiently between tables, no longer seeing just a server but recognizing a keen observer of human nature, someone who had used his position to document injustice. The young man's quiet dignity stood in sharp contrast to Thompson's own behavior. The lawyer's recent case had been all over the news. How had Thompson not made the connection? The victory had sent shockwaves through corporate America, forcing dozens of companies to re-examine their practices. And now Thompson had handed him perfect evidence for his next case on a silver platter. Photos of the lawyer's family at home, volunteering at community centers, and receiving awards filled the rest of the note's pages. The daughter's science project had won national recognition for its innovative approach to urban development. The son's basketball team had raised thousands of dollars for local youth programs. The mother's art was featured in galleries across the country. Each accomplishment listed in the note was a rebuke to Thompson's prejudices. These weren't people who needed his acceptance, they were leaders making the world better for everyone. His attempt to exclude them said more about his own limitations than their worth. A small group of business people stood up to leave, deliberately taking a route that led them past the family's table. They stopped to shake the father's hand, clearly familiar with his reputation. Thompson recognized several major CEOs among them, people whose opinion could make or break his own business deals. The note's weight in his pocket felt like a ticking clock. Tomorrow morning, his words and actions would be public knowledge. His behavior would be analyzed and discussed across social media. His business partners would distance themselves. His clients would disappear. Unless Thompson looked at his reflection in the restaurant's window. The man staring back at him seemed smaller somehow, diminished by his own actions. The note had offered him a choice, but it was really more than that. It was an opportunity, perhaps his last one, to be better than his prejudices. The note trembled in Thompson's hands as he read it for the third time, each word hitting him like a physical blow. The first part was a simple newspaper clipping, professionally printed and clearly recent. The headline read, "Landmark Victory. Local attorney wins historic civil rights case, securing justice for thousands." Below the headline was a detailed account of how the lawyer had just won a groundbreaking case against one of the country's largest corporations, proving systematic discrimination in their hiring practices. The settlement would change lives across the country, creating new opportunities for countless families. But it was the second part of the note that made Thompson's hands shake. In neat, precise handwriting, the waiter had documented every discriminatory comment, every subtle slight, every instance of prejudice Thompson had displayed over the past 8 months. Dates, times, witnesses, all carefully recorded. There were even quotes from other diners who had been disturbed by his behavior. March 15th, Thompson read silently. Mr. Thompson requested to be moved when a family celebrating their son's graduation was seated nearby. Direct quote, "I didn't spend a fortune on membership here to eat next to people like that." April 22nd. Complained about the changing atmosphere when a successful doctor and his wife were seated in the main dining room. Demanded to speak with management. The list went on, each entry more damning than the last. Thompson's face grew paler as he realized how long he'd been under observation, how his behavior had been noted and documented. The waiter had included photos taken by other diners of his previous outbursts, all dated and time-stamped. Then came the third part of the note, a simple statement that made Thompson's blood run cold. "Your behavior has been documented by multiple news outlets. I'm a journalism student working on an exposé about discrimination in high-end establishments. Tonight's incident has been recorded by at least 7 different diners on their phones. The story goes live tomorrow morning." Thompson looked up from the note, suddenly aware of the many smartphones that had been quietly recording his outburst. He noticed a famous local news anchor at a corner table, watching him with interest. A well-known civil rights blogger sat near the entrance, typing rapidly on her phone. The final paragraph of the note was perhaps the most powerful. "The man you just publicly humiliated. He's not just any lawyer. He's the same attorney who recently prevented your company's hostile takeover of several minority-owned businesses in the downtown district. His latest case. It involves discriminatory practices in private clubs and restaurants. I wonder how tonight's events would fit into that investigation." Thompson's wine glass sat untouched, the expensive Bordeaux no longer appealing. He could feel eyes on him from every direction, not hostile, but aware, watching, judging. The weight of his actions, not just tonight, but over many months, pressed down on him like a physical force. His phone buzzed. An email from his company's PR department. "Urgent. Social media mentions increasing. Multiple videos trending. Please call immediately." Another buzz brought a text from his business partner. "What have you done? Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning." The note's final lines seemed to glow on the page. "You have a choice to make, Mr. Thompson. This story can be about a man who learned and changed, or about someone who let prejudice destroy everything he built. The next move is yours." Looking around the restaurant with new eyes, Thompson saw what he'd been blind to before. The family he tried to humiliate was now surrounded by supple but clear support from other diners. The daughter was explaining her environmental research to an impressed-looking venture capitalist at the next table. The son was deep in conversation with a federal judge about his plans to study law. The mother's quiet elegance and the father's dignified presence seemed to fill the room. They weren't just surviving in Thompson's world. They were helping to shape it, to make it better. Their success wasn't an intrusion into his sphere. It was a testament to what America was supposed to be about. Thompson's hands crumpled the note slightly as he gripped it tighter. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The exclusive restaurant he considered his private domain now felt like a stage where his worst qualities had been put on display for all to see. His article was already gaining attention from local news outlets. Several editors had expressed interest in publishing his findings once the series was complete. He knew Thompson's behavior tonight would be a powerful addition to his work. But more importantly, the family's grace under pressure would show readers a different kind of strength. The waiter carried a tray of desserts past Thompson's table, noticing how the once proud man now sat hunched over his barely touched meal. The note had clearly shaken him. Good. Sometimes people needed to see themselves through others' eyes to understand the impact of their actions. He thought about his own parents, how they taught him to balance justice with compassion. When you fight wrong with wrong, his mother would say, everybody loses. That's why his article focused not just on exposing discrimination, but on highlighting the resilience and dignity of those who faced it. As he approached the family's table with their dessert order, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The chocolate soufflé he carried was more than just a dessert, it was a symbol of triumph. Not the loud, showy kind of triumph that needed to announce itself, but the quiet victory of people who refused to let others define their worth. The lawyer caught his eye as he served the dessert, and for a moment there was a flash of recognition. The waiter saw the subtle shift in the man's expression, a mix of pride and understanding. Perhaps he remembered that rainy Tuesday too, remembered how a simple act of kindness had rippled out to affect so many lives. The waiter straightened his tie, adjusted his serving tray, and continued his work. There would be time later to complete his article, to add tonight's events to his growing documentation of social change. For now, he had a job to do, and he would do it with the same dignity and professionalism his parents had taught him to bring to everything he did. After all, sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest actions: a bowl of noodles, a pro bono case, a carefully worded note, or simply doing your job well in the face of prejudice. The waiter knew his article would tell this story, not just of discrimination, but of hope, resilience, and the quiet power of standing up for what's right. The young waiter moved efficiently between tables, but his mind was 5 years in the past, remembering the day this successful lawyer had walked into his parents' small restaurant in Chinatown. Back then, he'd been a teenager helping out at the family business, watching helplessly as a large development company threatened to force them out of their location. His parents had worked for 20 years building their restaurant from nothing, serving traditional recipes passed down through generations. The development company had deep pockets and expensive lawyers. They'd offered a buyout that wouldn't even cover 6 months' rent in a new location. His parents, who had limited English skills, felt powerless against the corporate giants. Then one rainy Tuesday, this lawyer had walked in, ordered a bowl of noodles, and changed their lives forever. The waiter remembered how the lawyer had noticed his mother's worried expression as she read through another threatening letter from the development company. Without hesitation, he'd offered to look at their paperwork. That simple bowl of noodles turned into 3 hours of conversation, with the teenage son translating between his parents and the lawyer. By the end of the evening, they had hope for the first time in months. The lawyer took their case pro bono, fighting the development company with a passion that surprised everyone. Now, 5 years later, the family restaurant was still thriving in its original location. The waiter's parents had been able to expand, opening a second location across town. They'd even helped other small business owners in the community stand up against similar threats, all because one man had cared enough to help strangers in need. The waiter glanced at his phone between serving tables, checking the latest draft of his article. As a journalism student at the local university, he'd been documenting instances of discrimination in high-end establishments. His professors had praised his thorough research and balanced reporting. Tonight's events would add another powerful chapter to his growing exposure. He'd been working at La Maison for 8 months, carefully observing and recording the subtle and not-so-subtle ways certain guests were treated differently. His notebook was filled with dates, times, and detailed accounts of discriminatory behavior. Thompson wasn't the first to show prejudice, but he was certainly the most blatant. The young man's hands were steady as he served fresh bread to a table near Thompson's corner. His calmness came from years of watching his parents handle difficult customers with grace. They taught him that true strength often looked like patience, like doing your job well even when others tried to make you feel small. As he worked, he thought about his own journey. His parents had insisted he focus on his education rather than working full-time at their restaurant. Knowledge is power, his father always said in Mandarin. In America, education opens doors. They'd been right. His double major in journalism and sociology was opening his eyes to ways he could help create positive change. The note he'd handed Thompson wasn't just about the lawyer's recent achievements. It included carefully documented patterns of similar behavior Thompson had displayed over the past months. The waiter had dates, times, and witness statements from other staff members. He'd been building this case slowly, methodically, waiting for the right moment. He smiled slightly, remembering how his mother had always told him, sometimes the best reply to unkindness is success. The lawyer's family embodied that philosophy perfectly. They weren't just successful, they were helping others succeed too. The daughter's environmental research project included plans for sustainable urban development that would protect small businesses in gentrifying neighborhoods. The son was already talking about studying law to help immigrant communities. Between serving courses, the waiter updated his notes on his phone. Tonight's events would need careful documentation. He'd learned from the lawyer that detail and accuracy were crucial when fighting for justice. Every small observation could matter: the exact words used, the reactions of other diners, the way the family maintained their dignity throughout the incident. Around them, the restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm, but there was a difference in how other diners regarded their table. Respect and admiration had replaced the earlier tension. An elderly couple at a nearby table raised their wine glasses in a subtle toast. A group of young professionals nodded respectfully as they passed by on their way out. The mother caught a glimpse of their reflection in one of the restaurant's ornate mirrors. They looked exactly as they were, a successful, loving family enjoying a special evening together. Thompson's behavior hadn't changed that reality. If anything, it had only highlighted their strength and unity. As the evening progressed, their conversation flowed naturally between topics: the daughter's upcoming science competition, the son's recent basketball victory, the mother's new art series, and the father's landmark case. They spoke of future plans and shared memories, their voices mixing with the soft classical music that filled the restaurant. What could have been a ruined evening had instead become a powerful lesson for the children, one about maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice, about the strength found in family bonds, and about the importance of not letting others' ignorance dim your own light. Without saying it directly, their parents were showing them how to move through the world with grace and resilience. The young waiter returned to clear their plates, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the evening. As he worked, he couldn't help but admire how this family had transformed an ugly moment into an example of grace under pressure. He knew the note he'd delivered to Thompson would soon have its own impact, but for now, he took satisfaction in seeing this family's quiet victory over prejudice. In the wake of Thompson's outburst, the family's table had become an island of quiet strength in the restaurant's troubled waters. The father gently squeezed his wife's hand beneath the crisp white tablecloth, their fingers intertwined in a gesture that spoke of years of facing challenges together. His thumb traced small circles on her palm, a private comfort ritual developed over their 20 years of marriage. "Tell me more about your science project," he said to his daughter, his voice steady and warm. The teenager's eyes, which had begun to shine with unshed tears, gradually regained their usual sparkle as she focused on describing her work. Her passion for environmental science had already won her the state championship, and tomorrow she would present her research at the national competition. "I've added a new section about sustainable urban development," she explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. The tremble in her hands steadied as she reached for her water glass. The judges at the state level said it could have real-world applications for city planning. Her brother nudged her shoulder playfully. "Just don't forget to thank your awesome research assistant when you win." His attempt at normalcy, at preserving the evening's celebratory mood, brought a small smile to his sister's face. Though just 15, he showed wisdom beyond his years in knowing exactly what his family needed in this moment. The mother watched her children with fierce pride. She had raised them to hold their heads high, to know their worth wasn't determined by others' prejudices. Now, seeing them handle the situation with such grace, she felt that pride swell in her chest, mixing with the anger she kept carefully controlled. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said softly, reaching across to straighten her son's tie, not because it needed adjusting, but because she needed the contact, the physical reminder of her family's presence and strength. "He always said education and dignity were the two things nobody could take from you." The waiter approached their table with their main courses, his movements deliberate and respectful. He served each dish with extra care, his actions conveying what words couldn't in that moment. The perfectly plated meals were works of art. The father's herb-crusted sea bass, the mother's coq au vin, the daughter's vegetarian risotto, and the son's perfectly cooked steak. "Is there anything else I can bring for you?" the young waiter asked, his tone carrying a deeper meaning. The family understood he was offering more than just additional bread or wine. His quiet solidarity was clear in the way he positioned himself, almost protectively, between their table and Thompson's corner. "We have everything we need, thank you," the father replied warmly. His voice carried just enough to be heard by nearby tables, a subtle reminder that their evening wouldn't be ruined by ignorance. The waiter nodded, understanding the message beneath the simple response. As they began their main course, the daughter spoke about her dreams of studying environmental engineering at MIT. Her voice grew more animated as she described her plans to develop sustainable housing solutions for urban communities. The shadow of Thompson's behavior began to lift as she painted pictures of a future built on innovation and inclusion. Her brother, between bites of his steak, shared his own plans to follow their father's footsteps into law. "But I want to focus on environmental law," he added, grinning at his sister. "Someone's got to make sure her future inventions don't break any regulations." The mother watched her family with knowing eyes. This was how they had always handled difficulties, by turning toward each other, by focusing on their dreams and achievements, by refusing to let others' limitations become their own. She remembered her own mother's words, "Success is the best response to prejudice." The father cut his sea bass into perfect bites, his movements measured and calm. To anyone watching, he appeared completely unaffected by the earlier scene. But his wife noticed how he kept glancing at their children, checking for signs of distress. She saw the supple tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his movements. "I think this calls for dessert," he announced, his eyes twinkling. "After all, we're celebrating two things tonight, my promotion and your mother's new art gallery exhibition." He turned to his wife with obvious pride. "The curator said your work captures the spirit of modern resilience. I'd say that's particularly fitting tonight." The daughter's face lit up at the mention of dessert. "Can we get the chocolate soufflé? The one with the gold leaf?" The simple request, so normal and young, brought soft smiles to her parents' faces. Even in difficult moments, she was still their little girl who loved fancy desserts. The waiter's face was professionally blank, but his eyes held a quiet determination as he addressed Thompson. "Sir, I have a message for you." He held out the carefully folded paper with both hands, the gesture somehow formal enough to make Thompson take it automatically. The other diners watched with held breath as Thompson unfolded the note. His face, already flushed from his outburst, went through a series of expressions: annoyance, confusion, and then something that looked remarkably like fear. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he read, and those closest to him could see the color drain from his face. Whatever was written on that note had the power to silence him more effectively than any intervention from the staff or other diners could have managed. Thompson's eyes darted from the note to the family's table and back again. The father sat calmly, his arm now around his wife's shoulders, while their children demonstrated the kind of poise that comes from having parents who taught them to face adversity with dignity. The young waiter stood quietly, waiting for Thompson's response. There was something in his stance that suggested he knew exactly what the note contained and was prepared for any reaction it might provoke. The other servers had positioned themselves strategically around the dining room, ready to respond if needed, but their presence was so subtle that most diners wouldn't have noticed. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then Thompson folded the note with shaking hands and slipped it into his pocket. Without another word, he turned and walked unsteadily back to his table, leaving a wake of whispered conversations behind him. The regular hum of dinner service gradually resumed, though the evening's energy has shifted. The other diners now directed their attention to the family with subtle gestures of support, a raised glass here, a sympathetic smile there. The restaurant's atmosphere had transformed from one of tension to one of unspoken solidarity against bigotry. As Thompson sat alone at his table, staring at his half-finished meal, the weight of his actions seemed to settle on his shoulders. The note in his pocket felt like it was burning through the expensive fabric of his suit, carrying a truth he couldn't ignore. The evening was far from over, and his carefully constructed world had begun to crack around the edges. Thompson's discomfort finally boiled over as he watched the family receive their appetizers. The carefully plated dishes looked like works of art, garnished with the same attention to detail usually reserved for the restaurant's most valued customers. Something inside him snapped at the sight of their evident comfort in what he considered his exclusive domain. He pushed back his chair with more force than necessary, causing several nearby diners to glance in his direction. The legs scraped against the hardwood floor, creating a harsh sound that cut through the refined atmosphere like a knife. Standing up, he straightened his expensive jacket and walked toward the maitre d' station with deliberate steps. "Pierre," he called out, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I need to speak with you about the seating arrangements." His voice carried that particular tone of entitled displeasure that long-time service workers know all too well. The maitre d', a veteran of 30 years in fine dining, maintained his professional composure as Thompson approached. Several diners paused their conversations, sensing the building tension. The family continued their celebration, though the daughter's shoulders tensed slightly at Thompson's tone. The son glanced up briefly before returning his attention to his family, choosing dignity over acknowledgement of the growing disturbance. "This is supposed to be an exclusive establishment," Thompson continued, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room. "I've been coming here for 15 years, and I have certain expectations about the atmosphere." He put special emphasis on the last word, his meaning clear to everyone within earshot. The maitre d' stepped closer to Thompson, trying to keep the conversation private, but Thompson wasn't interested in discretion. "Sir," Pierre began in his accented English, "I assure you all our guests meet La Maison's standards of—" "Standards?" Thompson interrupted with a sharp laugh. "Look at what's happening to this place. Do you know how much I spend here every month? I bring my most important clients here. What are they going to think?" His voice grew louder with each question, drawing more unwanted attention. A couple at a nearby table set down their forks, embarrassment and disapproval clear on their faces. An elderly woman in expensive pearls shook her head slightly, sharing a knowing look with her dining companion. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from refined enjoyment to uncomfortable tension. The family, still seated at their table, maintained their composure with remarkable grace. The father placed his hand gently over his wife's, a subtle gesture of support and unity. The mother continued her conversation with her children, though her voice had grown quieter, more controlled. The daughter's eyes glistened slightly, but she held her head high, refusing to let Thompson's behavior diminish their special evening. "Perhaps, sir," Pierre tried again, "we could discuss this in my office." His suggestion was met with another dismissive gesture from Thompson, who was now fully committed to his public display of prejudice. "I don't need to go anywhere," Thompson declared, his voice echoing off the restaurant's elegant walls. "I'm not the problem here. When I started coming to La Maison, there were standards, traditional values. Now look at what's happening." He gestured broadly toward the family's table, his movement aggressive enough to make a young server step back quickly, nearly dropping his tray of water glasses. The restaurant had fallen almost silent now, the usual gentle murmur of conversation replaced by tense anticipation. The only sounds were the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers and the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen, where the staff had begun to gather near the door, watching the scene unfold. A distinguished-looking man at a corner table slowly stood up, clearly preparing to intervene if necessary. He caught the father's eye and received a supple head shake in return, a silent request to let the situation play out without escalation. "Sir," Pierre said more firmly, drawing himself up to his full height, "all our guests are valued members of the La Maison family. We do not—" "Family?" Thompson scoffed, cutting him off again. "That's exactly the problem. This used to be a place that understood its purpose, its heritage." He spat the last word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Now you're letting just anybody with a credit card walk in and—" The young waiter who had been serving both tables appeared suddenly at Pierre's side, a folded note in his hand. His arrival interrupted Thompson's tirade, though the tension in the room remained thick enough to cut with one of La Maison's silver knives. As Thompson observed these interactions, his initial reaction began to curdle into something ugly. He wasn't used to feeling like an outsider in his own domain, and the family's evident belonging challenged his assumptions about his place in this carefully ordered world. The daughter's excitement was visible as she discussed the menu with her mother, clearly knowledgeable about French cuisine. The son asked intelligent questions about preparation methods, showing an interest in culinary arts that impressed even the veteran waiter. Their conversation flowed naturally between topics, revealing education and cultural awareness that Thompson had assumed was the exclusive domain of people like himself. The father reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box, presenting it to his wife with a tenderness that spoke of years of deep affection. Even from his table, Thompson could see it was from one of the city's most prestigious jewelers. The wife's eyes glistened as she opened it, and their children's delighted reactions suggested this celebration was about more than just professional success. Thompson's growing discomfort manifested in his body language. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, and his grip on his wine glass tightened. The careful order of his world was being disrupted, not by any inappropriate behavior from the family, but by their simple presence and evident belonging in a space he had considered his exclusive domain. The sounds of the restaurant, the gentle clink of fine china, the pop of champagne corks, the murmur of refined conversation, continued around him, but Thompson's focus remained fixed on the family. Their natural enjoyment of the evening and the respect they commanded from staff and fellow diners challenged everything he thought he knew about his position in this social hierarchy. As the evening progressed, Thompson's internal struggle began to show in subtle ways. His responses to the waiter became shorter, his movements more abrupt. The tension building inside him threatened to spill over into something more visible, more public. The carefully maintained facade of sophisticated dining was about to be disrupted by something far less refined, his own prejudices bubbling to the surface. Little did Thompson know that his behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. The young waiter who moved efficiently between tables was observing everything with keen eyes that missed nothing. As Thompson's agitation grew more apparent, the waiter's hand slipped into his pocket, where a carefully folded note waited for the right moment. The evening was about to take an unexpected turn that would challenge not just Thompson's assumptions, but the very foundations of his worldview. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers bathed La Maison in a warm, golden light as the evening crowd began to fill the restaurant's elegant dining room. Located in the heart of Boston's historic district, La Maison had earned its reputation as the city's most exclusive dining establishment over 3 decades of serving the elite. The mahogany-paneled walls and pristine white tablecloths spoke of old money and carefully guarded traditions. At his usual corner table, Richard Thompson adjusted his gold cufflinks and took a measured sip of his 1982 Bordeaux. As the founder of a successful tech investment firm, he'd grown accustomed to the finer things in life. The maitre d' always kept his preferred table ready, knowing Thompson's habits down to his preference for the second-best table in the house. The best, he believed, was for those trying too hard to impress. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of Boston's wealthy and powerful. A state senator discussed campaign strategies over foie gras, while a renowned surgeon celebrated his daughter's medical school acceptance with champagne. This was Thompson's world, one of understated wealth and carefully cultivated connections. His attention drifted to the entrance as the maitre d' welcomed a family of 4. The father wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet success, while his wife's elegant burgundy dress complemented her natural grace. Their teenage children were dressed with the same refined taste, the daughter in a sophisticated navy blue dress, the son in a well-fitted dark suit that made him look older than his years. Thompson watched as the family was led to a table near his own, one usually reserved for the restaurant's most valued guests. The father pulled out the chair for his wife, a gesture that spoke of years of practiced courtesy. The teenagers sat with the kind of poise that comes from a household where manners aren't just taught but lived. The family's joy was evident but contained, appropriate to the setting. They were celebrating something. Thompson could tell from the way they leaned in close, sharing private smiles and quiet laughs. The father beamed with particular pride as he looked at his family, the kind of pride that comes from achieving something significant. What caught Thompson's attention wasn't just their presence but their ease in the space. They moved through the restaurant as if they belonged, and that's what bothered him. In his mind, La Maison had always been a certain kind of establishment for a certain kind of people. The family's comfortable presence challenged his long-held assumptions about who belonged in his world. As the sommelier approached their table, Thompson noticed how the father discussed wine selections with knowledge that suggested years of refined taste. The son listened intently, clearly soaking up knowledge about the world he was being introduced to. The daughter sat with perfect posture, her chin held high as she surveyed the room with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything. The mother's gentle laugh carried across the space, not too loud, just enough to draw a few appreciative glances from nearby diners. She had the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be bought or learned from etiquette books. Her children clearly inherited her grace, evident in their supple movements and quiet confidence. Thompson's discomfort grew as he watched other diners welcome the family with warm smiles and respectful nods. A retired judge from 2 tables over even stood up to greet the father, sharing a firm handshake and what appeared to be congratulations. The exchange suggested that the father was someone of significance in their shared professional circles. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted subtly as more regulars recognized the father. Whispered conversations carried fragments of words like landmark case and brilliant argument. Thompson felt his world tilting slightly as he realized this family might not just be visitors to his sphere, but established members of it. Their waiter, a young man who had served Thompson many times before, approached their table with particular attention. There was something in his manner that went beyond professional courtesy, a genuine respect that caught Thompson's notice. The waiter's usual efficient professionalism was tinged with what appeared to be personal admiration as he introduced himself and began explaining the evening's specials.